Hello everyone, in this episode I create my cracked and weathered concrete hardstanding. Grab yourself a cuppa and a packet of biscuits because this is a long one. Hello everyone and welcome to the Neo Model Railway. If you're a regular viewer or subscriber to the channel, nice to have you back, but if you're new, welcome to the channel. Last time around I created my control panel. Check out the video if you haven't seen that episode. I'm really happy with how it's working and how the end result came out. I do have a couple of changes I want to make. I need to extend some of the cables so I can move this box slightly to the left because I want it to be within the main hill area here, and at the moment it's just a little bit too far to the right over this area, which is where we're going to be having our engine shed. Now, I have been procrastinating and I do apologise. It has meant that this video is going out slightly later than I'd expect, but it's because I can't make a decision on what to do next in terms of my landscaping. Do I go ahead and build this hill here, or do I focus on the hard standings? In terms of hard standing, pretty much all of this area along the back where the main industry buildings are, coming all the way around here, over the rails on this section, and then underneath the main entrance house, and then ultimately over this section of track here on which the engine shed will be sat. All of this needs to have some sort of tarmac or concrete base. I've been procrastinating and preventing myself from moving forward because there seems to be so many different ways to create a concrete base. The first route I could take is simply to paint directly onto the board, and that's fine. However, I do want to have a little bit of texture, and what I don't want is wood grain showing through. That would require quite a few coats of paint, and I'm not a big fan of painting, so I want to keep that down to a minimum. The second and also quite popular route is to use some sort of wet material such as filler. I could slap it all over the board in a nice thick mix. I could add some texture. I could even add some cracks by hand if I wanted to, let it dry and then paint it. However, I am quite messy, so I'm a bit reluctant to go ahead and do that. I think doing that over the back would be absolutely fine, but coming over the rails and again doing it over here, I'm just really nervous about doing that. With paint, I could just go over it again and that shouldn't be an issue. But as soon as I start adding messy stuff to the board, I think I could be in trouble. So although filler affords me a little bit more flexibility, I don't think that's the option I'm going to be going with. Moving on from filler, there are some specialist materials out there, such as the AK tarmac, which I've come across, which actually is a kind of textured paint. I don't actually want to put tarmac down. I don't want asphalt as the main base here. I actually want concrete. So it seems pointless to use something which is designed for one purpose and then having to repaint it for another. I did consider using paint and adding sand, but I think at this scale I'm going to need something quite fine. And again, we're back into that situation where things are going to get messy and sticky, and if I do something wrong, I could be up the creek. So my extensive research has led me down the path of card or board materials. Now, thick card will give me a little bit of opportunity to add some markings in terms of cracks and gaps, and that would be okay. I could even possibly do some embossing and give it some sort of texture, but ultimately it would end up being quite flat. But foam board is another story altogether. And I've been researching various different polystyrenes and cardboards and sandwich materials which may do the job. Expanded polystyrene, or XPS, seems to be a material of choice because it allows you to manipulate the surface, add indentations and cracks and grooves, and then add your layer of paint over the top. This is the sort of material you find sandwiched in between two layers of thin paper or card on backing boards or mounting materials. If you look online at some modelling specialists, you can actually find XPS material as small as 3mm thick without any backing board, and that's exactly what I want for my project. However, I never plan ahead, and it is now the bank holiday weekend when I have time to record this video, so I'm going to be using whatever card material I have in stock, and let me show you what I intend to use. So whilst having a bit of a clear out downstairs in my office, I came across some of this, which is 5mm black backing board. This is an XPS core sandwiched between two pieces of paper It's not exactly what I want, but I have it in stock, I'm saving money, and to me, that's what crafting is all about, making use of the materials you've already got to hand. And in true Blue Peter style, here's one I made earlier. Now in front of me is my first attempt at doing some concrete using this method, and I think it's gone pretty well. I'm not necessarily happy with that colour because I feel that concrete needs to be slightly more yellow. However, this is darker with a tint of green to kind of denote that kind of old lichen which you tend to get on concrete when water sat on it and oil and dirt over a period of time. But you can see generally the slabbed concrete area which I created with these score marks, and there's a little bit of cracking going on, some highlights, a little bit of texture, and the whole thing's picked out with a little bit of a dark wash as well. I took some photos during my test process and I'll pop them on screen now for you to take a look at, but I feel like it went okay for a first attempt. One thing I will note is that because this is the backing board which has the paper sandwich, the paper can kind of interfere when you're trying to make score marks, and I think that's why people are recommending using XPS without any paper sandwich or laminate on top, simply because it gives you more control over creating textures and scores and cracks and so on and so forth. But as I've mentioned in previous videos, this is my first ever model railway, and I'm having to learn all these various modelling techniques as I go along. As you'll have seen from the images, I have purchased a couple of models. One is a diesel fueling area and the other is a water crane. So let's drop these both on now as an example of how they look in situ. And there we go, I've just dropped them into position randomly on the board just to give you a comparison of the model colours against my first attempt at creating a hardstanding. So I think this method is the method I'm going to go forward with. As I said previously, I think I'm going to lighten this up and make it a slightly more yellow because I believe concrete has a slightly lighter, more orangey brown tone. I've got examples that I've taken of concrete recently. Sad as it is important to make sure you've got something to compare to when you're doing colours and paints and all this sort of stuff. So yes, I'm randomly walking around taking pictures of the floor and that does give you a few weird looks from people, but needs must, people, needs must. Okay, that's enough waffle. Let's get on with it. The first thing I think I need to do is cut the card. I've removed all of my models from the top of the board, all the various buildings, and I have to say I'm coming back to that same point I keep making. Having those connectors so that I can disconnect things easily is an absolute godsend. But there they are, all stashed to the side and ready to go. Unfortunately, one of these cables has just popped out, so I've pushed it back in. I'm hoping that's not going to give me a long-term issue, but we'll have to see. I've offered up my test to see how things line up against the track. So, one thing I'm not particularly happy with is the fact I'm having to use 5mm. I say having to use, it's just what I've got in stock. I think 3mm in terms of thickness would be a much better thickness for this card. 5mm offers up very close to the tops of the rails in terms of thickness. That's fine potentially over here where I'm going to be crossing over the rails. I will have to scarf the back of the card just to get it over the cork base and the sleepers, but that should work okay. But it does mean there is quite a drop off from the edge of the concrete to what is in effect the actual floor base. I will be ballasting this, so in this area you're going to see ballast stone coming across. That's fine, but in other areas it might just look a little bit too excessive. But I think in all honesty I'm nitpicking, so let's get the card out and get the areas cut that I want to have on my baseboard. Okay, I'm working from behind the cameras at the moment, I apologise for that. So I've got my board, a straight edge, a pencil, and I obviously need some sort of tool for cutting. Let's just open that up. I've got a relatively good craft knife, that should do the job. I've got a spare if needs be. Right, now this board is at least 10 years old. In fact, I've got a feeling that this may even be 15 years old. And that's the reason I want to use it. Make use of the things we've got. So I want to use the straight edge along the clean rail here. And I kind of want probably, I'd say 10mm around the edge, because I'm either going to add shingle or grass just to finish off the boundary of the scene. I'm going to push this right up against my cork here. Now this is already telling me that my cork isn't quite square with the board. And that's fine, doesn't need to be absolutely perfect, but just kind of parallel. because I can always fill in, as I say, with some scenery. So that's where I want to be. I'm doing this by eye. Doesn't need to be perfect. Certainly not in this first attempt. So I shall just mark that line along there to make sure I don't lose where I am. Oh, I don't like that. I don't like putting metal rule on top of the track. Okay, so let's just come back. I'm going to do this on the board, the other side, so you won't see this on camera, sorry. Couple of scores. Just one more, just to cut the paper on the underside. There we go. So that's the first piece, which I will stick down there. Right, I now need to do this section which comes down here, and it's going to taper. Now I haven't decided whether or not I'm going to continue the concrete round so the road comes in here, or whether I want to continue the concrete down a little bit for this area. I haven't decided what kind of scenery I'm going to have here, if anything at all. A fence may come round, or I may have grass, or I may have some sort of aggregate dumping area. I just don't know. Okay, so that is okay along this side, and I want to mark just there. I'm going to come and mark the other side, coming along, and again, very much by eye, but keeping that 10mm, so that should be parallel. I shall mark that and then give that a cut. Doing this overhand just so you can see. I advise if you're doing this, do it properly. Doing things overhand is never best. Coming around. Okay, so now for the slightly tricky bit, I need to score myself a line which stays in keeping with the track as it comes around and bring it all the way down here. I will worry about the bit that goes over the track later, I think. For now, if I just get this curve in place, then I can always add an extra bit over the top later. Okay, I'm going to lean in and do this by eye, although it has just reminded me I still haven't done anything with the track in the corners. I think that has gone out the window. I'm just going to cut this off eventually. Now I could run a pencil line down here, but I've just realised I might be able to just very carefully press into the track, which is what I'm doing now. I don't want to damage the track, of course, but all I need is just a very subtle line that I can follow. Let's see if that's made a difference. Barely, although I can just about see it, just about. There's a very faint pair of lines coming up and down here. Just about catch that on camera. Okay, let me see if I can score the right side of that line. Okay, fingers crossed, that's what we've got. I think I'm going to have to do some trimming. Let me just bend over and pick up the other piece. Pop that back on the board, like that. That's going to come in there. That's not bad for a first attempt. My line is cleaner, so I'm going to trim this off and come down there. The key here is definitely take your time. If it's going to take you 4 or 5 passes, then take 4 or 5 passes. If you try and get it right first time around and cut it short, you'll regret it. Right, I'm almost there. I just need to take out the back of this piece so the points have enough space to move, and then we'll be done and I can focus on this next area up here. Solid progress made. I have got all of this back area in, and I've also cut a slot down here because I've decided that I won't continue the concrete right to the end. I don't want it to look too concretey. This may just be an extra gravel area. It may be where they have old machinery or rusted old skips. just a bit of a dumping ground. So I think I can make that just a little bit more interesting. So the next challenge is to come over and do this area. Now, by now, I was hoping to have built my engine shed, my new Metcalfe model, but I haven't. So I'm going to cover this area, and I will have to come back once I have the engine shed just to make sure I know where this area is going to be. But for now, I'm going to come up this side so that the signal box sits on the concrete hard standing. I'm going to come down, and I'm probably going to sail past the edge of the entrance house, the gatehouse here, and then I'll come right up almost to this area here. So all this will be concreted. So this area here is going to be a little bit more complicated than I was expecting, mostly just because I've got to get everything aligned with the track, and also it's just an odd shape. So I'm going to take my time. I've pressed down into the track here, and then I've marked that on the other side, and I'll show you that again in a minute. But I also want this kind of hard standing to come over these two lines here. So I haven't yet decided how I'm going to do that, whether I'm going to bring it around almost to here and then come across perpendicular, so it's a nice square area. Do I want to sail it on beyond? I think I probably would. If you imagine, most of the sort of engineering and maintenance areas are obviously concreted up to the rails, and then beyond. So things like the fuel area, the coal bunker, and the water tower, all that sort of stuff will be sat on top of that hard standing. Right, I think this is going to be a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. So this grey pencil mark you can see here is actually the indentation of the nearest rail, this side, along this track here. And I want to cut up to, well, as close to that as possible, I suppose, give or take 1 or 2 mil, because this is going to be sailing right up to the track with the engine shed on top. I will need to scarf the back of the board. In other words, just take a section of this out, so it's just the top which we use across. Yeah, okay, getting complicated. Gonna have to make this up as I go along. So a bit of a top-down view here then. As you can see, the track is running up and butting up alongside the card, and it's coming up to the actual rail here, and I've got that nice and tight. If I just press this down, you can see, and I've also cut the sides, so that is running flush with the baseboard. Now, I think I'll angle this back a little bit further, but the next job is to cut the back of this, because at the moment this card is sitting, I don't know, 2 or 3 mil proud of the rail, and that means I won't be able to get a single thing on that track until I cut the back off so that it sits nicely over the cork and the sleepers. So I need to take basically about 10 mil off the back of this all the way down to just cover the cork and the sleepers as just mentioned. So I think I'm going to take at least 2 or 3 off the back. So what I'm going to do is just locking my finger as a guide rail, like a fence, against the edge of the board. I'm just going to insert there. I don't know how well this will come out on camera. And I'm just going to pull this down carefully. There we go. And guide it all the way down. Just taking my time. Okay, so that should just come off as a strip. May need to do a little bit of tidying up. Careful there, right in the middle. Yeah, that's where I ran off course. And there we go. We have now a nice rebate along that edge, which should cover the cork and the sleepers. And that is pretty good, people. That's pretty good. And that is flush, give or take, I'd say 0.5 mil difference. I can just feel the edge of the board here over the rails, but I don't think that will cause any issues in terms of derailments. If needs be, I can always just almost sand it back. Okay, I'm really happy with that. Just a tiny bit of tidying up in this corner here, and then I need to sort out what I'm doing in this area. But I think for now, that is where I'm going to leave it. I think it's time to get on with some painting. Okay, progress has been made. I've got some glue on the backs of the boards and I just need to get them down and in position. I'll weight them down to make sure they stay flat. And then I shall come back once everything is dry and continue on with the process. Let me just get this into position. As you can see, I've drilled the holes and I've just tidied up the back. Okay, that first one is on. So let's get some weights like that. Okay, so I just need to do this one, and as you can see, I've added a couple of extra corners because I wasn't quite happy with how I cut it. There's a corner over there, but it doesn't matter because this kind of rough edge can just be part of some really old crumbly concrete. Well, I think the glue has properly dried now, so it's just a case of lifting off all of these weights. Just stick them on the sofa beside me for now. And then I shall give everything a quick check, but it's looking okay. This bit here is obviously a key area that I need to make sure is good. It's a little bit raised there. That's all stuck down nicely. There's a raised corner there. I'm not too fussed about that because that might be a bit of a visual feature. And the rest of it is looking good. So the next steps for me are to get some scribing tools, start to mark in the expansion joints that you'd normally typically see in the concrete. Once I've done that, I'll put some cracks in and possibly even start to pick out some certain areas to make it look like the concrete has crumbled. And then it's the job of painting. The tool I'm going to be using is a simple scribing tool, a bit like this. You can get these in wood or in plastic. They are inexpensive. This one's actually come from one of my kids' art kits. It has a rounded end with a bit of a chamfer and the other end is nice and pointed. So that should give me all the control I need in order to put the lines into the top of this board here. In terms of the expansion joints you often find on big concrete slabs, those generally start to kick in at around 6 meters square. So if we're doing this on 00 scale, we are looking at approximately 80 millimeters on each side of a square. I've got my ruler, I've got my straight edge, it's time to scribe. Well, it's fair to say that progress has been made. I now have all of the card on the board. I have scored the expansion joints. As you can see, I've added cracks. I've added missing pieces of concrete. So the next step is to paint. But before I do, let's just get a little bit closer and look at things in a bit more detail. So here's a great example of the work I've done in terms of the expansion joints. I've added cracks and I've picked apart the foam to show areas of missing concrete. You should also be able to see a subtle indentation, a subtle texture on the surface. This was created using some rolled up tin foil, giving a nice textured surface, pressing it down and just making sure things aren't absolutely perfectly flat. I suspect I will lose some of that texture in the painting, but it's there just to help things out. This is the area which will be going over the track, so I'll be dealing with that later on. For now, if I just get a bit closer, you should be able to see some subtle grooves that I've placed into the concrete here. Now, the way I see it, some of this concrete is going to have been replaced over the years, and areas that have a lot of traffic and footfall are going to be used more than others, in which case I felt that perhaps this area has very recently been replaced. And so what I've done is I've added these little groove lines which represent tamping when the concrete has been newly laid. There's also a newly tamped area here which has been patched, and you can see all of the expansion joints in play. Quite how this is all going to come out once painted, I don't know, but I am excited to get that process underway. Last but not least, I have left this area because I do want to get my engine shed on there first. In my mind, the engine shed base would be one single piece without any expansion joints. So what I'll do is once I've actually built this, I'll sit it on the board and then I'll mark the exterior perimeter, and then I can finish these lines off. It may mean that I don't actually get around to completing all of the painting this session, but that's fine. I think as long as I get this front area done, I'll be really happy. So with that said, and before this video becomes an absolute epic, it's time for me to crack out the acrylics. With all my bashing, scribing and texturing complete, it's now time to get some colour on the board. In front of me, I believe, is everything I'm going to need. I've got a couple of tins for mixed in paint. I've got some kitchen roll for dabbing off the brush when it's too wet, a pot for my water for mixing and thinning things if I need to. And of course, I've got my cheap acrylics on the right hand side. Black and white to create that base grey, and then brown and yellow, as I said previously, just to bring it into that slightly earthy tone, which I think concrete should have. Then of course I've got some brushes. I've got a bigger one here for getting the base colour on in the first place, and a couple of smaller ones which I'll just be using for a bit of finessing and dabbing later on. And of course, most importantly of all, a coffee. Right, time to get going. Now, I am no colour expert, but this is closer to the sort of colour I'm looking for. Beige with a little bit of grime. I think that will be a pretty good base colour. I can add touches of light and dark later on. So let's get this on the board. So that's the first coat on. One thing I didn't take into account is obviously that things are going to come out slightly different and slightly darker, given the fact that it's going on to a very dark grey, almost black board. But that's fine because I do want to give it another subtle coat on top. I have added a bit of water, as you saw when I was mixing the paint, just to make this go on a bit thinner. I'm not too fussed that I haven't got into all the nooks and crannies and all of the grooves, because the expansion joints are normally a black material. So if that shows through, that's not a terrible thing. However, some of the cracks really should have this colour. Again, I will be touching a lot of this up later. Doesn't need to be perfect. So I shall let this dry and then I'll get another quick coat brushed over the top. And then it's a case of starting to look at some highlights. For the second coat, I have mixed something just a little bit more beige, because this is closer to what concrete should actually look like. And depending on whether or not I've got my colour grading correct on my video footage, you should see that this is kind of a tan colour. And there is actually a colour out there called deck tan, which is what I'm trying to replicate. That is potentially a little bit too caramel, but for now, I'm going to just stick that down, because by the time I've got some white highlights and some flecks and also some dark wash on there, I think things will start to look okay. Best not to mix using a brush, because not only do you load your brush up too much, but also in amongst there, I can see it, is some of the original dark brown, and that's just going to come through in streaks. The second coat of tan has gone on pretty well. What I've done is just let it dry enough that it starts to get a bit tacky. And then I'm coming back around with my brush. I'm just scraping over to give it a bit of a texture. And I'm doing it almost on a square slab per square slab basis. And what that will do is when we add a wash, it will kind of allude to that kind of brushed concrete, tampered concrete that you'd normally see on the ground. It also means that I'm removing any excess paint. Right, I'll go ahead and finish all this, and I'll see you back here in a minute. The next step of the painting process is to use a wash. This is used to pick out all the different details that I've created on the actual surface. There are many excellent wash brands out there, but for an area as big as this, and in order to keep costs down, I'm going to make my own. All you need are 3 simple ingredients. In my case, I'm going to be using a black acrylic. This is the same cheap acrylic that I've been using on the rest of the project. Obviously, we'll be using water as our mix, and that will be used to thin it down. And last but not least, we need something to break the surface tension. So a couple of small drops of washing up liquid is all you need. I'm using a white tub so that I can actually see the wash on the inside. What I'm going to do is mix it up so that it's just got the right texture, that it runs a bit like a very loose oil. For those of you red wine drinkers, it's a bit like having a good quality red wine with the legs running down the sides of the glass. So I'm just carefully mixing up my wash here, and this is an example of a wash that's too thick. There's too much paint still in the body of the wash. You can see I'm almost painting the side of the tub here, and that's one of the reasons why I'm using a white tub, so I can clearly see that. So I need to go and add some more water to this. It doesn't matter if it gets a bit bubbly, because obviously the washing up liquid in there will start to make it bubbly. So let me go add some water and I'll bring you back in shortly. So this is now a much better consistency. This is more what I'm aiming for. If I just put that around the edge, you can see how it runs down the sides. And that's the analogy I was aiming for when I was talking about red wine on the inside of a glass. You can see that kind of consistency. So now it's just a case of very evenly coating my concrete area, not having the brush contact too long, because otherwise we'll start to remove the paint which is underneath. So a very quick, concise action. Now you'll notice it will start to dry really quite quickly because it's just so thin, and the material underneath just acts as a sponge. So before it gets too far ahead, I'm just going to grab a paper towel and very lightly just dab over. Now it may be that I need to come back and add some more over the top, because I don't want to leave too much in terms of texture with regards to my dabbing, but you can see how that's just starting to highlight some of the key areas, and we can always do another coat if we feel we need it. With all the paint fully dry, it's now time to add the final detail, which is a little bit of black and white specks. Once that's on and dried, I'll just tone that down with a little bit of wire wool, and then the job should be done. I've already masked up the track just so I can make sure that I don't get too many paint specks everywhere, but I can also hold a piece of paper up whilst I'm doing it. One thing I will say now everything is dry is that the wash has made everything really much darker than I was hoping for. You can see the area where I didn't wash too heavily, which was over this supposed new concrete area, and it is slightly lighter. Everything else is quite dark. Now, there's an argument to say I could have added more of a base coat, or equally I could have thinned down my wash a bit further. When you hold up the original card against the newly painted concrete, you can certainly see there's a difference. I was just hoping for something a little bit lighter. So first of all then, I've mixed up a ratio of 1:1 white acrylic paint and water. That should give me the consistency I need just to be able to flick this gently off the brush and onto the concrete. So let's give it a go. My gut feeling is this is where things are about to get messy. And there we go. Now if you make a mistake like this and a blob drops off, all you need to do is just quickly dab it off. And we should just give ourselves a very subtle highlight. There we go. Same process for the black paint then, 1 part water, 1 part acrylic paint, just making sure this is properly mixed, and then I shall flick this on as well. So that's all the speckling done, and whilst that's drying, let me talk about the very final stage of this process, and that is to either grab a piece of very fine sandpaper or emery cloth, or in my case, I'm going to use a very small amount of wire wool. Once everything is absolutely dry, and I do mean absolutely dry, you can then very lightly sand over the top of the surface. What this should do is just pare everything back and blend everything in, and if I'm lucky, it should just take off a little bit of wash and show some of the lighter base colour through. And I do mean lucky because we are talking about microns here in terms of the thickness of the paint. So I'm going to peel off the masking tape and let everything dry behind the scenes, and then we're on to the next step. I've done 1 row of the concrete slabs here with this small piece of wire wool, and as you can see, it's now starting to lighten and generally just blend in all of the features. So I'm going to continue across with this row and you'll see how it works. Now the aim here is to keep with the grain, and I have gone in this direction, and so I'm just going to make sure that I'm carefully following that process, and I'm almost not touching at all. I'm only putting the lightest amount of, lightest amount of pressure on here. Obviously, if I go too deep, we'll start to be back down into the original black paper, and beyond that, the black foam, which we don't want. Now, this is underneath one of the warehouse buildings, so I don't need to focus too much, but I'm just going to be consistent. But as you can see, it's lightening up quite nicely. Nice grey, warm tone. Right, let's continue on with the next patch. So there we are, everybody. We got there in the end. Now that was an epic video. Took me a couple of weeks to actually put this together, primarily just because I had to make sure every stage was absolutely dry before moving on to the next. I hope you found some really helpful tips and techniques in this particular video. I know there are many different ways which you can achieve a very similar result, so I'd love you to leave some comments below. Let's start the discussion. I'd love to see how you guys are doing it. Give the video a big thumbs up if you like the content. I'm still trying to grow the channel and hopefully get this content out to the wider populace. If you're already subscribed, great. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been here more than once before, however, I'd like you to hit subscribe. Come on, you know it's worth it. My next task will be to build my Metcalf engine shed. I can then get that onto the layout and finish off the hard standing area. Beyond that, I think we're very close to needing to do either some ballasting or starting to build this big hill area on the back of the layout. Either way, I hope to see you in the next episode. Take care everyone, bye bye.